Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be looking at who are the four atheist horsemen of the non-apocalypse. Now, the New Atheism movement was a loosely collected movement in the early 2000s, which made the case against religion. This was less of a single philosophical position and more of a broad movement, which was particularly identified with books published around the same time by four authors: Harris, Dawkins, Hitchens, and Dennett. The popularity and accessibility of those books brought criticism of religion into the public sphere in a new way. These four were sometimes called the Four Horsemen of New Atheism or the Four Horsemen of the Non-Apocalypse. Most of these criticisms were not philosophically novel. They weren't something new that was being presented. They weren't really presenting that many new arguments, or were they especially rigorous? However, they were presented in a format that was accessible to the masses in an importantly new way. All four books featured high on the New York Times bestseller list for many weeks. These books also advocated for atheism in a more active way than had been acceptable in the past. Some popularity of these works may have been driven by negative reactions to religious fundamentalism following the 9/11 attacks and the Bush presidency, or the general rise in Americans identifying as religiously unaffiliated. Non-religious Americans sat at only about 5% of the population constantly from 1970 up through the early 1990s, but by the early 2000s, when these books were being published, that percentage of the population had exceeded 10%, and that percentage continued to rise to include nearly a third of all Americans today. Some argue that there's little that links these authors together beyond atheism and the particular time frame that they were writing in. Others argue that New Atheism can be construed as a philosophical position, albeit a loosely defined one. When it is defined, New Atheism includes three main components: the lack of a belief in God, namely the atheism part; the claim that science can study, critique, explain, and disprove religion; and the claim that secular morality can exist, and it should lead us to reject religion. Since each of these authors has their own unique viewpoints and doesn't necessarily share all of those tenets, or at least formulate them in exactly that way, we're going to cover them individually, looking specifically at an iconic book from each during this period of time. The goal is not to give a systematic explanation or critique of each book, or give you the full arguments that are offered by the authors, but rather to whet your appetite if you're interested in reading more. So, first off, Sam Harris. In 2004, Sam Harris published The End of Faith, which was in some ways a direct reaction to the September 11th attacks. In it, Harris argues for active critique of religion, and that when moderates and non-theists fail to critique extremist religion out of a sense that religious views are in some way immune to polite critique, they allow fundamentalism to fester and grow. Harris makes a lot of points in this book, but this is one that kind of shines through, I think, in an important way. It was this pushing against the idea that, we should tolerate others' religious beliefs to the point of not critiquing them at all, because he makes the case that when you do that, it can allow people to hold very problematic beliefs, very irrational beliefs, and beliefs that can lead to real harm. And while Harris begins with a critique of Islam, particularly Islamism, check out our video on that for more, he soon parlays into a critique of Christianity throughout history along the same lines, particularly eventually the modern Christian right that attempts to force others to abide by theocratic politics. Harris is really critical of these religions that attempt to kind of access the tools of state, break down walls between church and state, and impose their views on others. Now, some have criticized Harris as pushing too far in the opposite direction against tolerance, as being a militant atheist, or for oversimplifying religious passages. A response that has been offered to some of these critiques is that while Harris may not have been engaging with the most recent academic theological interpretations of religious texts, neither are the preachers, imams, rabbis, or congregants who are actually being presented with those texts and acting on the same simplified understandings of those texts that he presents. That largely theologians that are critiquing his works are completely divorced from the actual practice of religion, and Harris is engaging with the practice of religion, not the academic theologians who are not actually talking to the congregants or the preachers in that same way. And so his critiques could be then directed at those specific congregants or those specific preachers, imams, etc., who are preaching those religious texts in that perhaps more simplified way, but therefore he still has an argument against them, even if he doesn't have an argument against the overall theologians. Overall, throughout the New Atheism movement, there was less of this kind of engagement with some of the academic history of both theology and philosophy, and more with the engagement of the common person, for lack of a better word, and their views on religion and the arguments that might be offered at that level. In 2006, Richard Dawkins, the evolutionary biologist, published The God Delusion. In it, he makes the case that, from a scientific standpoint, evolution better explains the world we see than creationism. He also argues that science can offer an alternative explanation for the existence of religious belief within societies. He makes the case that morality is innate, based on the evolution of empathy, claiming that few religious people would suddenly start committing rape, murder, or robbery if they knew for certain that no God existed. Dawkins also makes the case that religion does more harm than good in society, and that it's especially harmful to children, equating the religious indoctrination of children to abuse. Now, some have accused Dawkins of a certain level of scientism. Check out our video on scientism for what that is, as well as some critiques of it. Essentially assuming away issues with scientific methodology and making the dubious case that science, and only science, can in some way provide truth. Now, in 2007, author and journalist Christopher Hitchens published the book God Is Not Great. In it, he touches on many of the points that Dawkins did, arguing that religious claims are inconsistent with science, disputing philosophical arguments for religion, and pointing out contradictions in religious texts. However, I would argue that the case that Hitchens makes most strongly, and makes in particular, is for the harms that religion causes to people in daily life, in terms of the wars that it causes, the violence it causes, the genocides that it causes, especially in the attempts of religion to impose their views on others, on those of other religions, as well as the non-religious. He provides descriptions of the violence and harm that religion has caused around the world and throughout history. The book has been critiqued over disputes of whether or not he accurately describes the actions of the church throughout history, as well as for taking literalist interpretations of holy texts, though, as Hitchens and others have argued, many theists do take literalist interpretations of these texts as well, and so he's justified in critiquing that viewpoint, even if, once again, it's not necessarily a viewpoint shared by the academic theologians that we're offering such a critique, because he's engaging with the common people and their views. Once again, a piece of this new atheism is this idea of books that are accessible to the masses, that we're engaging with how the masses viewed their own religion, as opposed to how the ivory tower viewed them. Finally, Daniel Dennett. So Daniel Dennett is in some ways the odd man out in this bunch. He's the only professional philosopher in the group and provides what might be described as a more nuanced and less forceful case against religion. In his 2006 book, Breaking the Spell, he makes the claim that religion is not off limits from scientific inquiry and uses science to investigate it. First, he makes the argument that science can and should study religion. Second, he argues that the rise of religious belief can be explained through scientific assessment, specifically mimetics, the concept that ideas evolve in a similar way to species, with those ideas that are able to spread and last being the ones that hold out and continue to exist in cultures and society, not necessarily the most truthful ideas. He argues that religion is one such idea that isn't necessarily true, but is simply an idea that's very good at sticking around in people's heads. Finally, he makes the case that rejecting supernatural explanations, such as religion, can encourage rationality, it can encourage evidence-based reasoning, and it can encourage more ethical behavior, and therefore we should do our best to reject these supernatural explanations, these religious explanations, and foster an environment of rationality and evidence-based reasoning. Dennett's work has been received more positively by critics than the others, and it does have a little bit more of that academic bent. But there are still some theists that, of course, disagree with his assessment of particular components of religion. Now, while I have deep sympathy for the cases made by the new atheists, as a skeptic, I am a bit disquieted by the blind assertion that science can provide certain truth, and that it's the only means of finding truth that shows up in some of these works. While the new atheists make a convincing case that science and religion are irreconcilable, there are many reasons that we might think that scientific claims stand on just as shaky a footing: the problem of induction, the problem of underdetermination, etc. That said, they had a significant impact on making atheism and an atheist worldview more accessible to the masses in the 21st century. It's impossible to tell whether such a movement led to the marked decrease in religion in the US in the following decade, or if it was merely a signifier of a trend that was already happening and going to happen without these thinkers and these books. But it is an important movement and milestone in the journey of modern atheism, particularly in the English-speaking world. Now, before finishing, something deserves to be said of Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She was an ex-Muslim and fierce critique of the treatment of women in Islam. She was at one time considered the fifth horseman of New Atheism, or as Dawkins once put it, the four horsemen plus one horsewoman. However, her critiques were primarily directed at Islam, not religion in general, which perhaps presaged her recent conversion to Christianity earlier this month. In the wake of this conversion, questions have been raised of whether New Atheism as a movement has in some way failed. But while the particular brand of atheism championed by the Four Horsemen may have fallen out of style for being too militaristic, too pugilistic in some ways, the underlying shift in American society is undeniable, with some projections showing that Christians will fall to less than 50% of the U.S. population in the coming decades, due largely to a rise in non-religious people. What do you think? Have you read anything from the New Atheists? What parts of their works do you agree with? What parts do you disagree with? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, buddy.